Welcome everyone to a lecture on Heidegger and the eyes of the gods, der Blick der Götter, the eyeing of the gods, or the glancing, the gazing of the gods. Before I, though, go into Heidegger, I'll say a few words about gods in general in Greek thinking. Not so much about Greek mythology, but the Greek experience, the Greek way of thinking and being in the world, which we can unearth through language. We shouldn't just think of the theoi as anthropomorphic entities, but quite differently. The gods are regional. They are in charge of a certain region, for example. And let me also say very briefly before I begin that if you'd like to study Heidegger more closely and more intensely with me, then please follow the link down below in the description of this video. In the Greek, theos, the word theos, is a notion of experience also. So it's a region, but the region itself can be a landscape, it can be the ocean, etc. But it can also be a dimensionality, a certain dimension in which a certain experience is possible. And hence, beckonings are the language of the gods. And this is similar also for Heidegger. Die Stiftung des Seins hängt von den Winken des Gottes ab. So the gifting or the sending of being depends upon the beckonings of the God. Of the God with an article means that we are here outside the metaphysical question of faith and knowledge. It's also important to note that for Heidegger, the God, and as is well known, he proclaimed only a God can save us now, which should not be conflated with a Christian God or even a Greek God, which have long flown away. And perhaps this is what he said in the Spiegel interview, which was published in the 1970s after his death. Perhaps I should also mention that in volume 73.1 of his collected works, Heidegger says that the gods appear through death. So it is through finitude that for us the gods can appear again. But the God in question is nothing other than time, a spanning open of the four-dimensionality of time. And it is a thinking, a certain way, a certain mode of thinking that lets itself in, that allows itself to be guided into, be a sacrifice of time. It's a finite way of thinking, mortal thinking. And the sacrifice of time means to say that the time is bounded up here, concentrated. And the sacrifice indicates that it is not to be, it cannot be repeated or brought back to life again once it has occurred. So in this manner we can understand perhaps more closely that how God, or this God, is time and what kind of a sacrifice mortal thinking must make. The theoi, the gods for the Greeks, are not only regional and dimensional in terms of experience, they are also the ones who look at us, and they are the ones who attune the human being, and they give measure. Sie sind maßgebend. They give measure and they attune, and therefore also co-determine. They steer and they send. There is a gaze or an eye that meets you and that attunes you and that gives measure and that remains the measure for once the God or a God has eyed you. The measure the God has given remains the measure for all creation and acting in a certain dimension. The God is not something else or anything other than time. Again, a time that cannot be repeated, but a time that is allotted for the right Augenblick, and we do not control this time. We cannot make it a controllable, we cannot will for the Augenblick of this time to come. So the notion Heidegger speaks of Augenblicksstätte, the site of the moment where the eye, in the blick, in the gaze, in the look, not quite sure how to translate blick, hits you and meets you, and in this sight there is a coming together and there is a play of time and space. There is a time of a space that then is spun open, and it is, however, when this kind of a Zuspiel, what is playing itself forth, granting, gifting itself, when this occurs, is open. And this is Heidegger's way of denying any kinds of attempts at omnipotence that perhaps the late modern subject has, but also the omnipotence of God without an article. For example, God as causa sui, as is the name of the God of metaphysics, the self-causing cause, as Heidegger says somewhere, which is a God that no one can sing nor dance for. So what plays itself along and what also plays into this time of a space that is opened up has certain limits, and it can succeed and it can of course also fail. And this is this moment of Ereignis, because in any succeeding Gelingen in German, which is related to Glück, which is not a feeling, but it is the Gelingen, the coming together of what is striding apart and then brought into harmonia, as the highest possibility of that which can come together in a Fügung, a fugue, or a certain destiny. But so again, it is the God that, or the gods that look at us sometimes, but we are not per se always already just open to being addressed by the gods. In Homer, for example, it is clearly very often stated that even though the gods may be present in a certain situation, it does not mean that everyone realizes that next to them stands a god. The god appears in something familiar, and all of a sudden, for example, as a dove in the case of Athens, or as a fellow human being, but all of a sudden in the familiar, the unfamiliar shines through and the godly shows itself. Now, what Heidegger also says about, and perhaps I think this is important, about Ereignis. I'd like to point out a few things here. Ereignis is, I think, mistranslated as the event of appropriation. There are certain reasons for why this translation has become the accepted translation. But Heidegger says, and it's quite striking, that in the original translation of Der Satz der Identität, the leap of identity, usually translated as the principle of identity, which is a mistranslation also. Heidegger states that Ereignis is a word taken from grown natural language and is as untranslatable as the Chinese Tao and the ancient Greek Logos. However, the original translator of this text, completely omits this passage and also the passages where Heidegger explains where the word Ereignis comes from, because it would have been inconvenient. It was much more convenient to just historicize the entire text and say it's just the event. Oh, there's something happening. Hence, we don't have to worry about it. But Heidegger points out that there is Eräugen in there. So, looking towards or coming into the field of vision, of the view, of Aussicht, which was also, to my knowledge, the title of the last poem that Hölderlin wrote, Aussicht. The Ereignis is what looks at us. Philosophically, what has always looked at, or what has always opened up the realm of vision for mortal thinking, was the Ereignis. And metaphysics has tried to respond to these different ways of being, withdrawing itself, about which Ivo de Gennaro in one of our dialogues said that the word nothing is still saying too much when we try to consider or think the withdrawal of being. Now, none of this, when Heidegger addresses, and with Hölderlin addresses the Greek gods, is an attempt to say that there's a golden age thousands of years ago which we have fallen off from, or that there must be a return to Greek mythology even. No, but there is what Heidegger calls heilige Trauer, holy grief. There is an awareness that this will not return, this epoch, and it cannot. But what is possible is a metamorphosis, a recurrence through metamorphosis, and through recollection and deep memory. So, because only when we realize this utter withdrawal in our time of the divine, that the gods have indeed flown, then we become open for the future, where the future then no longer just is tabula rasa, which is seemingly only there to be controlled by the machinations of the will to will. And to lose the God is, of course, also to be open to this utmost loss and withdrawal, and not just that God has died, but the gods or the divine itself has disappeared, and hence nothing looks at us with a warm, bright light that brings into view a way of experiencing dimensions of being human or being on the earth that could be outside of the operations of Gestell, of technology. The flashes no longer hit us. They no longer take us out of our thrownness into Gestell, which is what would be the task of, or what would be the way of Geschichte, which is a granting of tidings and abidings that we can hear or not hear. So, perhaps also briefly to mention, I've mentioned this somewhere else before, but I'd like to say it here as well. When Descartes calls into doubt everything, including his own hands and body, and doubts whether the human beings that he sees outside are indeed even human or even there, he effectively, this is not, I want to say, a method. This is not a method. methodological doubt. It is the fundamental and founding experience of modernity. This radical, fundamental doubt that is the mood of modernity, and hence the will to absolute certainty, to understand knowledge and wisdom as absolute certainty, truth as absolute certainty, and the sciences, or rather the methods through transcendental idealism, as a way of establishing a knowledge of domination over an objectified world of appearances which are to be standing ready without inherent contradiction or opposition or resistance to the whims of the willing subject. All knowledge is willing, Hegel says, after all. So with Heidegger, we have to give up on any notion of subjectivity or subjectivism and let ourselves into a thinking of the reine Geschehen, the pure occurring, taking place, betiding itself. So, in the Parmenides lecture, which is volume 54, Heidegger goes over the daimon and addresses the daimon also briefly. I'll just mention this in passing, where the daimon can mean has nothing to do with demons, not even in this imagined version today when we say, well, but the Greeks did understand demons differently. Diomai, this middle voice form, means to allot something, to be allotted. And to be allotted, so the daimon is not some entity that's whirling around doing something to us and we must bring them in good order, eudaimonia. No. These are again dimensions of allotting and parting over something to someone, and in this manner perhaps we can understand daimon a bit better in the Greek sense. But Heidegger also claims that there is dio or diein, which means to burn in there as well, or to put on fire. So there's not just the showing itself or parting itself over or allotting oneself to, but also burning, attuning again. Of course, we are reminded here of Heraclitus' fragment on the ever-living fire, which allows for the meshes to measure themselves, as it were, and to let themselves be granting the measure to cosmos, to the good order of the world. The gods address us through whispers, but also pneumatically, through breathing. Like the spirit is also breathing for Hegel, breathing life into what is. In Greek, it's important to realize that the medial form or the middle voice form is neither active nor passive. It's painful to try and translate into English medial forms. A medial form, for example, in Heidegger would be his remark in section 7a of Being and Time on thainestai, which is the root verb for phenomenon, which does not mean to show itself, as for example, I show myself to some degree in this video, etc., or something of me shows itself. It is neither active nor passive, but there is an announcing itself which occurs, and which in its occurrence we must allow to address ourselves as. And then in our response we draw something out from the phenomenon that then begins to crystallize more clearly, but of course cannot be corroborated or pinned on on a wall or so behind us. As I mentioned before, Greek gods do not show themselves. They never show themselves. If they do show themselves, then it's to the detriment of the human being. We should also perhaps point out that the word theater comes from the Greek, as is often the case in many words that are with a th. From theao or theaomai, again the medial or middle voice form, again to look at, to eye, to view, to bring into view. And blicken is, however, and this is important, blicken, to eye or to view, in this radically different manner, is not a representational mode of seeing. It's not a historicizing representational mode of seeing that comes with pre-formatted representations or ideas which then the world is attacked with, almost, right? When we have a certain representation about what something is supposed to be, and we say I have a certain idea of what a museum is supposed to look like, etc., etc., and look out for perhaps for this way of thinking. What Heidegger is trying to remind us of is that for us to see something at all, to see it, to truly see it, not just to walk by and take a picture, etc., is when, for example, a church or a temple invites us in to be seen in the first place. And then we must become open to it. And this we cannot control. We can go to St. Peter's Dome and stare at it for days, or walk through it with millions of others as if it were Disneyland, but nothing shows itself to us. And this is very visible now, or was very visible before travel was interrupted last year. So maybe it's now even becoming more crystallized what is occurring in our time. So something must, in its own view, in its own profound, true, genuine look, must it open up itself to us. And this we do not control. It approaches us, the church approaches us, for example, when we are open to see it. And this is a completely different way of seeing it. And it's not formatted, right? We don't go there and say, oh, this is this church built then and then. But as a friend of mine related to me, when all of a sudden cycling through France, coming upon a fallen down Gothic church without knowing anything about it, there was something at the gate of the church that opened up at least a glimpse of an echo of a world that once was, and in its having been, still weaves and strives through what is to come and now is. Representation, however, is something else. Representation comes to the world with already a pre-formatted schema and approaches the world only through a schematism. It's important that Kant explicitly speaks of schematism and time in the first critique. But there is here no epiphany of something showing itself in and by itself, to which then we respond. And of course the Vorstellen in German also has not just the notion of represent, which in English doesn't really transport what the German says in Vorstellen. To represent means there is something present and I represent it mentally, for example, and then compare my representation with the object, however that's supposed to be possible. If all I have access to is representations, well, this is how philosophy of mind is never going to go anywhere, but this gives people jobs, of course. So, in Vorstellen, there's also the notion of placing before oneself, and the digital, virtual, sphere, shall we say, and also a video such as this one, is one of placing before you a certain, you can almost say a certain shadow world in which a true, genuine, profound, deep looking upon the world, being looked at, is perhaps not entirely impossible, but is hindered. In serendipity, for example, our capacity, openness to see something in the world that spontaneously emerges is not made entirely impossible, but is severely stifled by the operations of the digital, as it interferes with what we can, in just a general vernacular, would call the real world or reality. So, but perhaps there's a way here to find modes of playing with this, that the digital is not a stifling, but an enhancement of what can be seen through a bringing back of deep memory of what has been in other ways of seeing. I wonder what a non-subjectivistic digital age would look like. And also perhaps, let me say, that the all-seeing eye never sees itself, and it is a cold look, cold gaze that is ultimately dead. Thank you very much.